Excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm in danger. The voice on the 911 tape is shaky, urgent, and filled with terror. They tried to kill me, sir. I'm at 18th Street Expressway and I-70 by the train yard. Now I'm laying down like it's a war zone. My name is Kyle Dunivan. And then silence. The call lasts 3 minutes. Dispatchers try to call him back, but his phone goes straight to voicemail. Hours turn into days. Kyle never comes home. If you are new to this channel, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like this video and comment where you are watching from. The first thing you hear is the apology. It's faint, hurried, as though the man on the line feels guilty for even taking up space in this world. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm in danger. The words crackle through the 911 dispatcher's headset, startling in their urgency. On the other end of the line is a man who sounds both exhausted and terrified. His voice trembles, but it is unmistakably clear. He believes someone is trying to kill him. The dispatcher leans forward, adjusting the volume. Calls like this aren't unusual, but something about this one is different. The caller doesn't sound drunk, doesn't sound incoherent. There is no slurred speech or scattered nonsense. Instead, there is a rhythm, desperation laced with clarity, fear balanced with determination. My name is Kyle Dunivan, the man continues, forcing his identity into the record. I'm at 18th Street Expressway and I-70 where the train yard is. I honestly feel like my life is in danger and they tried to kill me, sir, and they tried it and they tried their hardest. Now I'm laying down like it's a war zone. There is a rustle, the sound of movement, perhaps gravel under his body, maybe the crunch of weeds near the railroad tracks. For a moment, the dispatcher imagines him crouched in the darkness, phone pressed to his ear, peering over his shoulder for shadows that may or may not exist. Okay, sir, I need you to stay calm. The dispatcher begins, ready to coax more information to piece together the puzzle of panic. But Kyle barrels forward, refusing to lose his chance to be heard. They made me think they were my friends and they made me think they actually cared about me. So I brought everything that is registered in my name, and I'm not a felon. I have registered firearms and they have them there. His words spill out in one breath, like a man trying to leave behind a record in case he doesn't survive. Excuse me, he says again, his politeness strange and heartbreaking against the backdrop of fear. I'll explain the whole story, sir, if you get somebody with a squad car. The dispatcher types furiously, flagging the location, noting the urgency. A squad car is dispatched. But in the sterile fluorescent glow of the dispatch center, there is no way to measure the full gravity of Kyle's words. They are data points on a screen, an urgent but routine call in a sea of emergencies that fill every shift. For 3 minutes, Kyle's voice threads between panic and composure. He wants to be believed. He wants help. And then, suddenly, the line goes dead. The dispatcher waits, staring at the empty line, the hum of silence pressing into his headset. Calls don't just end like that. He dials back immediately. The phone rings once before diverting straight to voicemail. But there is no beep, no option to leave a message. Just emptiness. On the screen the case sits unresolved. Kyle Dunivan, male, 31, location pinged near the train yard off I-70. Possible weapons. Possible danger. Officers en route. The truth, however, is that no one truly goes looking for Kyle that night. A squad car rolls through the area, headlights sweeping over asphalt, overgrown weeds, the skeletal structures of industry. But the search is from the safety of the car. No one steps onto the gravel, no one calls his name into the night air, no one pushes deeper into the shadows where Kyle may be hiding, or where danger may already have consumed him. Hours later, the call remains unresolved. The log is filed, the night moves on. But for Kyle, that call may have been the last lifeline, the last chance. And it slipped away into the quiet neglect of bureaucracy. When his family later learns about this call, it will devastate them. But tonight, June 2020, they are still unaware. To them, Kyle is just unreachable, silent, missing. To them, the fear hasn't yet taken shape. Imagine Kyle in those final minutes, alone in the sprawl of the Kansas City rail yard, the clatter of distant trains echoing across the dark. The night air heavy with humidity, the faint chemical smell of oil and rust. Every shifting shadow a threat, every passing headlight a potential savior. Phone clutched tight, chest heaving, mind racing with betrayal. Friends who weren't friends, people who wanted him dead. Whether those threats were real or imagined, one thing is undeniable. Kyle believed them. And he begged to be saved. But the system failed him. The haunting part is not just the call itself, but what it represents. The missed opportunity. The moment when action could have been taken. A foot search. A thermal drone. Even a simple connection between this panicked 911 plea and the missing persons report that would be filed the very next day. Instead, 3 minutes of desperation were lost in the shuffle. Later, Kyle's mother will torture herself replaying these words, "They tried to kill me." She will imagine the dispatcher's office, the glow of screens, the distant squad car circling like a predator too cautious to step into the field. She will imagine her son, crouched low, waiting for help that never arrived. In retrospect, this moment becomes the center of everything. The story of Kyle Dunivan doesn't begin with his struggles, his relationships, or his mistakes. It begins here with a man whispering into the darkness that he is in danger, and then disappearing. Because the question that will haunt everyone who hears this tape is simple. If someone had truly listened that night, would Kyle still be alive? To understand the tragedy of Kyle Dunivan, you first have to understand the man behind the voice on that desperate 911 call. Too often, when people vanish, or worse, when their remains are discovered, the headlines strip them of their humanity. They become a case file, a statistic, a cautionary tale. But Kyle was not just a missing person. He was a son, a brother, a friend. He was complicated, flawed, but deeply human. And like so many whose stories end in mystery, his life before that night was full of both promise and fracture. Kyle was 31 years old in the summer of 2020. To outsiders, he might have looked like any other young man trying to find his footing in adulthood. He had a job, stressful, demanding, sometimes overwhelming. He had a relationship, intense, volatile, and difficult to navigate. He had hobbies, friendships, and the kind of restless energy that kept him moving forward even when the ground beneath him felt shaky. But underneath the surface, Kyle was wrestling with storms most people never saw. Kyle's job demanded long hours and endless focus. It wasn't the kind of work that left you at peace when you clocked out. It followed him home, gnawed at his sleep, crept into his conversations. Stress clung to him like a second skin. His family saw the toll it took. He was quick to frustration some days, withdrawn on others. There were nights when he would vent to his mother or his brother, talking about how overwhelmed he felt. And yet he kept pushing forward, unwilling or maybe unable to slow down. For Kyle, work wasn't just a paycheck, it was a measure of worth. And no matter how much it wore him down, he couldn't walk away. Then there was his relationship. To call it complicated would be an understatement. It was a bond that swung wildly between affection and chaos, between tenderness and volatility. Friends worried about him. His family worried too. But love has a way of blinding even the sharpest eyes. Arguments turned into reconciliations. Breakups blurred into makeups. The cycle repeated itself so many times that it became the rhythm of Kyle's personal life. It was exhausting, but it was also intoxicating. For a man already under immense stress, the highs were an escape, even if the lows cut deeper every time. To truly see the pressures building in Kyle's life, you also have to acknowledge his history. Years before his disappearance, Kyle had battled substance use, drugs and alcohol that seemed to offer relief but only deepened his struggles. At one point, those battles culminated in a terrifying episode of psychosis. Whether triggered by chemicals, stress, or both, it left scars. But Kyle was not defined by that moment. He moved forward. He worked hard to rebuild his stability. He tried to stay clean, to keep himself tethered to the people who loved him. His family never stopped believing in his potential. They saw the good in him, the humor, the generosity, the way he could light up a room when he was at his best. Still, the shadow lingered. And later, when his mother filed his missing persons report, she mentioned it. She told the police he had once struggled with mental health issues. At the time, it felt like the responsible thing to do, to give authorities every possible detail. But in hindsight, she would torture herself for those words. She would wonder if that single disclosure painted her son in a light that made it easier for police to dismiss his cries for help. What's often lost in stories like this is the person behind the labels. Kyle was not just a man with mental health issues. He was funny. He was stubborn. He loved music, loved laughing with his family, loved the simple pleasures that made life worth living. His brother remembers conversations late into the night, about dreams, about frustrations, about the future. His mother remembers his softer side, the way he'd apologize when he knew he'd gone too far, the way he still, even as a grown man, wanted her approval. He was imperfect, yes, but he was real. And the people who loved him never saw him as anything less than worth fighting for. As 2020 wore on, however, those who were closest to Kyle noticed subtle shifts. He was anxious more often, restless, distracted. His phone calls sometimes carried a sharp edge of paranoia, as though he sensed dangers invisible to others. At first, his family chalked it up to stress, the weight of work, the turbulence of his relationship, the uncertainty of the world during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. After all, everyone was struggling in some way. But looking back, those moments now seem like warning signs. The week before his disappearance, Kyle mentioned feeling like people around him weren't who they seemed. He hinted at betrayal, at deception, though he never offered specifics. His words were cryptic, unsettling. His family didn't quite know what to make of it. In the days leading up to June 20, 2020, Kyle seemed to teeter on a fragile edge. Some conversations were normal, even hopeful. Others veered into darker territory. He hinted to his brother that he might be in danger. He confided feelings of distrust, as though the ground beneath him was shifting. On one call, he described being near the Kansas River Bridge. His words were erratic, difficult to follow, but the urgency in his voice was unmistakable. It was a voice that carried both fear and resignation, a man trying to put his reality into words, hoping someone would understand. Then came the 911 call, the desperate plea that would become the centerpiece of his story. A call made not in a vacuum, but at the end of a long road paved with pressure, pain, and fractured trust. Hindsight is cruel. It allows us to see patterns that weren't clear in the moment. To Kyle's family, the signs of strain scattered across those final months now look like breadcrumbs leading to an inevitable collapse. But in real time, they were just fragments, anxieties, frustrations, moments of doubt, none of which foretold that he would vanish into the Kansas night and never return alive. Before the storm, Kyle was simply a man trying to hold it all together. He was chasing stability, chasing love, chasing the peace that always seemed just out of reach. And then, in a single night, everything unraveled. For those who knew Kyle deeply, the man who disappeared was not a mystery at all. He was complex, yes, sometimes troubled, but never someone who simply walked away from life without reason. Yet, to the authorities, the fragments of his past would soon be weaponized against him, reducing him to a stereotype, a statistic, an afterthought. Years before his disappearance, Kyle had endured a bout of psychosis. It was not the story of a man forever lost to madness, but rather of someone who stumbled, struggled, and eventually found his footing again. The episode, like so many, was born of a toxic brew, alcohol that dulled his sharp edges, drugs that clouded his mind, and an avalanche of stress he had never learned how to carry. For weeks, he drifted through shadows, losing sleep, hearing echoes that weren't there, unable to tether himself to the ground. It terrified his family. His mother, in particular, saw her vibrant, witty son unravel in front of her. Yet she also witnessed the strength it took for him to climb back. With treatment, rest, and determination, Kyle clawed his way back to clarity. He laughed again. He worked again. He rebuilt his life brick by brick. To the people who loved him, his past was not a definition but a reminder of his resilience. But trauma has a way of lingering, not always in the person who lived it, but in how others remember it. When Kyle was eventually reported missing, his mother sat across from officers and answered their questions. Each word she offered carried weight, but one in particular came with dread. When they asked if her son had any history of mental health issues, she hesitated. She knew the truth, but she also knew the cost of speaking it aloud. Yes, she admitted softly. Years ago he went through a psychotic episode. But he recovered. He's been fine since then. Her voice shook, not because she doubted Kyle's recovery, but because she feared how they would interpret her answer. In that single confession, she could feel her son slipping away, not from her heart, but from the seriousness with which his disappearance would be treated. Later, she would replay that moment endlessly in her mind, regretting the honesty she had offered. To her, it felt like the police had seized upon that detail as a convenient excuse. A way to file his case under the category of not urgent. A man with a troubled past, they reasoned, was probably troubled still. Maybe he wandered off. Maybe he relapsed. Maybe he didn't want to be found. To them, he wasn't a missing son. He was a man with a history. Mental illness has long carried a weight that breaks more than spirits. It breaks trust, credibility, and compassion. Even in the 21st century, the stigma remains powerful. For families like Kyle's, it is a double wound. First, watching a loved one suffer, and second, watching society reduce that person to nothing more than their illness. Kyle's mother understood this cruel calculus. She saw it in the shift of the officers' eyes, the way their pens seemed to slow when she mentioned his psychosis. To her, it felt like an invisible door had closed. She had walked into the station demanding urgency, begging for action, but she left with a hollow sense that she had just handed them permission to dismiss her son. Friends and family rallied around her, reminding anyone who would listen that Kyle was more than a single chapter of his life. He was kind, creative, stubborn in the best way. He cracked jokes that lit up a room. He was fiercely loyal. And yet, in the cold language of police reports, that one phrase, history of psychosis, carried more weight than all the testimonies of love and loyalty combined. At night, lying awake, Kyle's mother thought about the forms she had filled, the words she had spoken. What if she had kept that part hidden? What if she had simply said, "No, nothing like that"? Would the police have acted faster? Would they have searched harder? Would they have believed her desperation? The guilt gnawed at her, though deep down she knew the fault was not hers. She had told the truth because she believed honesty would help. Instead, honesty had shackled her son to a narrative he could never escape. Every call she made to the authorities afterward was filtered through the same quiet dismissal. She could hear it in their tone, the condescension, the unspoken suggestion that perhaps Kyle's disappearance was self-inflicted. That perhaps, after all, this was not a mystery to solve but a problem to be forgotten. Within the family, the topic of Kyle's past became a point of tension. Some argued that bringing up his psychosis had doomed the case from the start. Others insisted that the truth always finds its way out, and lying would have only delayed the inevitable. But no matter the debate, everyone agreed on one thing. The system was not built to protect people like Kyle. It was easier, after all, for the authorities to assume the worst than to search for the truth. Easier to categorize him as unstable than to recognize him as vulnerable. Easier to close the file than to face the possibility that his disappearance might be evidence of something darker, something criminal, something that required accountability. The more time passed, the more Kyle's mother felt her initial fears solidify into reality. She feared that her honesty had cost her son the urgency he deserved. She feared that in some way, her words had signed the paperwork that would doom his case to neglect. And most of all, she feared that she would never forgive herself if the truth about Kyle's fate remained buried. But behind her fear was anger. Anger at a system that demanded truth but punished it, anger at a culture that still treated mental illness as a stain, and anger at herself for believing the police would rise above their biases. Kyle's story was never just about his struggles. His psychosis was a fracture in a life otherwise full of love, connection, and potential. But to the authorities, that fracture was enough to define him. They didn't see the man who had rebuilt himself, who had carried on after falling. They only saw the crack and mistook it for the hole. And so, as the family searched, as they posted flyers and pleaded with neighbors, as they called every hospital and morgue, the police filed Kyle's story away with a sigh, convinced that his disappearance was an echo of his past rather than a present danger. It was easier to blame the victim than to admit the possibility of failure. In the end, Kyle's mother carried her fear like a stone in her chest. The fear that the one moment she tried to be transparent was the very moment her son's case was lost. She did not yet know how chillingly true that would become. Because when the truth of Kyle's disappearance finally surfaced years later, it would expose not just the tragedy of a lost life, but the far greater tragedy of a system that had failed him from the very start. Nightfall in Kansas City always carried a certain weight. Train horns echoing through the rail yards, headlights slicing through the humid air, the Kansas River flowing dark and silent beneath its bridges. But on the night Kyle Dunivan vanished, the city seemed heavier, as though it too bore witness to something it could not explain. That night Kyle called his brother. The voice on the other end of the line was not calm, not steady, but urgent, alive with a pulse of fear that could not be faked. He told his brother he was near the Kansas River Bridge. His words came in bursts, disjointed, erratic, but his message was unmistakable. He felt hunted. To anyone listening, his tone would have been enough to spark immediate alarm. He wasn't rambling aimlessly. He wasn't drunk and incoherent. He was afraid, and he wanted someone, anyone, to understand that danger pressed in on him from all sides. Kyle's brother, used to hearing both his playful jokes and his rare moments of stress, felt the shift immediately. This wasn't the Kyle who called to chat or to vent, or to laugh about something absurd. This was Kyle with his voice sharpened by adrenaline, his thoughts racing faster than his words could carry them. "I'm near the bridge," Kyle repeated, his breathing heavy. "The Kansas River Bridge. They're after me." "Who?" his brother pressed, but the line only filled with static, pauses, fragments. Kyle spoke as though someone might be listening, as though his words could betray him if he said too much. Then the line went dead. For his brother, the silence that followed was unbearable. He replayed the conversation in his head, searching for details, for clues. What bridge exactly? Who was they? Was this paranoia, or had Kyle stumbled into something real? Not long after, Kyle placed another call, this time to 911. The recording that survives is chilling, not just because of what he said but because of how he said it. His voice cracked with exhaustion and desperation, but there was clarity too. "Excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm in danger," he began, his words rushing out like a flood he could no longer contain. "I'm at 18th Street Expressway and I-70 where the train yard is. I honestly feel like my life is in danger and they tried to kill me, sir, and they tried it and they tried their hardest. Now I'm laying down like it's a war zone." Even through the static of the recording, you can hear the weight in his voice, the certainty that something was horribly wrong. "They made me think they were my friends," Kyle continued, "and they made me think they actually cared about me. So I brought everything that is registered in my name, and I'm not a felon. I have registered firearms and they have them there. Excuse me. I'll explain the whole story, sir, if you get somebody with a squad car." 3 minutes. That's all the call lasted before it ended abruptly. When dispatch tried calling back, the line went straight to voicemail. His phone was never recovered. What made the conversations so haunting was how specific they were. Both his brother and the 911 dispatcher heard him reference a location: the Kansas River Bridge, the area near I-70 and 18th Street Expressway. These were not vague ramblings. He was giving coordinates in his own way, a breadcrumb trail to follow. Yet no one followed it. The police, relying only on their squad car, never stepped out on foot to search the darkened rail yard. They didn't cross-reference the 911 call with the missing persons report filed the very next day. If they had, they might have realized that the frantic voice on the call was the same man whose family was desperately pleading for help. Instead, Kyle's words slipped into the void, cataloged but not pursued. When Kyle's family filed the missing persons report, they had no idea he had even called 911. That crucial piece of information was withheld from them for over a year. During that time, they searched on their own, clinging to the last detail they did know. Kyle had told his brother he was near the bridge. So they focused on the Kansas River, scouring its banks, flying drones overhead, even tossing an 80-pound feed bag into the water to watch which way the current would carry a body. They followed the river's pull because Kyle's words had pointed them there. What they didn't know was that he had also spoken of the rail yard, a location hauntingly close to where his remains would eventually be discovered. If they had known about the 911 call then, their search would have narrowed. They might have found him sooner. They might have even found him alive. When his remains were finally located more than a year later by a KDOT employee, the discovery site was agonizingly close to where Kyle had said he was. His last words had painted the map. The answers were there in his voice, preserved on tape. But no one had followed the sound. The chilling truth was that both his brother and the dispatcher had been given the same haunting clue. Kyle was near the bridge, near the river, near the rail yard. Both conversations pointed to the same small, confined area. And yet, for reasons no one could quite explain, that area was left unexplored until it was too late. What cuts deepest about those last conversations is not just the words themselves, but the fear threaded through them. Kyle wasn't asking for sympathy. He wasn't exaggerating for attention. He was begging for help. To hear his voice on the 911 tape is to hear a man fighting to be believed in his final moments. He was lucid enough to give his name, his location, the details of his situation. But his fear made him sound like a man already lost, as though he knew the odds were stacked against him. It was not the voice of someone walking willingly into the night. It was the voice of someone being chased by shadows we still don't understand. For his family, the what-ifs are unbearable. What if his brother had been able to keep him on the line longer? What if dispatch had sent a foot patrol into the area instead of driving by in their squad car? What if the police had told the family about the 911 call when it mattered most? Each unanswered question gnaws at them, deepening the sense of betrayal. Kyle's last conversations were not the ravings of a man lost in delusion. They were lifelines, messages thrown into the dark, asking someone to reach back. No one did. Now those conversations play on repeat in the minds of his family. His brother hears the last words he ever spoke, heavy with panic. His mother hears the dispatcher's recording, his voice fading into silence. Each replay is torture, a reminder of both his desperation and their helplessness. But they keep listening because within those recordings lies the undeniable proof of his humanity, the fact that Kyle tried to survive, that he reached out, that he left behind a trace. In the end, Kyle's last conversations are more than just evidence. They are echoes of a man who should still be here, whose warnings should have been heeded, whose fear should have been met with action. Instead, they stand as haunting reminders of a system that failed to listen, and of a family left to piece together the truth from fragments of sound and silence. The Kansas River Bridge, the rail yard, the echo of a frantic voice, these were Kyle's last coordinates. He gave them freely, desperately. But they were ignored, and the price of that neglect was his life. The morning after Kyle vanished, his mother's worst fear began to harden into reality. He hadn't come home. His phone rang endlessly, calls rolling into voicemail. Messages went unanswered. Every hour that passed without word from him deepened the dread until, finally, the family took the only step left to them. They reported him missing. In Olathe, Kansas, his mother filled out the paperwork, her hands trembling as she signed her name to the words missing person. To speak those words aloud was to admit the nightmare, to confess that Kyle was gone, that something beyond her control had swallowed him. The officers asked the standard questions: age, appearance, clothing, habits. Did he use drugs? Did he drink? Did he have mental health issues? Each answer weighed like a stone. She told them everything she knew, hoping the truth would spark urgency. But when she mentioned his past psychotic episode, she saw the shift immediately. The officer's pen slowed, his face neutralized, and her son in that instant seemed reduced to a single word: unstable. Still, she believed they would act. She had to believe. But what she didn't know, and what would take more than a year to discover, was that on the very night Kyle disappeared, her son had called 911. He had given his location. He had begged for help. And the authorities had not told her. That 911 call should have been the cornerstone of the investigation. It should have sent officers combing the rail yard, sweeping the Kansas River Bridge, flooding the area with lights and sirens. At the very least, it should have been the first piece of information relayed to the family. Instead, it was locked away. The family spent the first days stumbling in the dark, calling hospitals, scouring shelters, begging anyone for a sighting. They retraced Kyle's last known movements, leaned on friends, and pieced together fragments of his final hours. But the most vital fragment, that their son had already told someone where he was, remained hidden. What? The question would haunt them forever. When the family pressed the authorities for updates, the responses were vague. We're working on it. We're keeping an eye out. We'll let you know if anything turns up. It felt less like a search and more like stalling. Days turned to weeks. Hope began to sour into suspicion. The family couldn't shake the feeling that something important was being withheld. Why weren't the police canvassing the area? Why wasn't there a search party? Why weren't dogs brought in? The silence was deafening. Later, when the truth emerged about the 911 call, it was not framed as a mistake. It wasn't a clerical error or a slip of the tongue. It was, in the family's eyes, a choice. A choice not to disclose information that might have changed everything. Had they known, they could have gone straight to him. They could have searched the rail yard, scoured the bridge, combed the area where he had said he was. Maybe they would have found him alive. Maybe not. But at least they would have had a chance. Instead, that chance was stolen. And so, for more than a year, they carried on a blind search, unaware that the answer had been sitting in a dispatcher's log the entire time. For Kyle's mother, the omission was not just negligence. It felt like betrayal. Every sleepless night, every hour spent pacing the living room, every desperate plea for updates had been carried out under false pretenses. She had assumed the police were sharing everything they knew. She had believed they were allies in the search. Instead, they had left her groping in the dark, searching miles of riverbanks while the real clue sat untouched. The silence from the authorities did more than prolong the family's suffering. It deepened it. Because when Kyle's remains were eventually found, it was not only grief that crushed them, it was the knowledge that it hadn't had to end this way. While the police moved slowly, Kyle's family moved with urgency born of desperation. If the authorities wouldn't search, they would. If the system wouldn't bring answers, they would tear them from the silence themselves. In the days after his disappearance, they organized their own ground searches. Friends and relatives canvassed the neighborhoods, stapling missing posters to poles, knocking on doors and showing strangers his photo. His brother, driven by guilt and determination, retraced the last conversation they had, walking the length of the Kansas River Bridge, calling his brother's name into the night air. But the river gave no answers. With no guidance from police, the family relied on instinct. Kyle had said he was near the bridge, so they focused on the water. They combed the banks, trudging through mud and reeds. They searched the currents with binoculars, scanning for any sign of clothing, movement, or debris that might be him. When the water grew too wide to search with eyes alone, they turned to creativity. One evening, they carried an 80-pound feed bag to the bridge. With aching arms, they heaved it over the railing, watching it splash and vanish into the dark current. Then, with flashlights in hand, they followed its course downriver, hoping to trace the path Kyle might have taken if he had fallen or been thrown in. It was a desperate experiment, but desperation had become their only strategy. They borrowed drones, sending them buzzing over the water, their cameras tilting and panning across endless miles of rippling black. From above, the river looked infinite, swallowing light as quickly as it reflected it. But no matter how many flights they launched, no trace of Kyle appeared. Every negative result felt like both a relief and a defeat. Relief that no body had surfaced. Defeat that the mystery remained unsolved. All the while, the authorities' contribution was little more than a drive-by. Officers cruised the area in their squad cars, glanced out windows and reported nothing unusual. No boots on the ground, no drones, no dogs. Just the shallow sweep of headlights across the darkness. For Kyle's family, the contrast was infuriating. They were dragging the river with homemade experiments while trained officers barely stepped out of their vehicles. It was as though the police had written Kyle off before the search had even begun. Each fruitless day carved deeper wounds into the family. They barely slept, barely ate, consumed instead by the need to do something. His mother walked until her feet blistered. His brother pushed himself past exhaustion. They clung to the hope that if they just searched hard enough, if they just looked from the right angle, they would find him. But hope is a cruel companion. It keeps you moving long after reason tells you to stop. And so they searched, day after day, chasing shadows on the water, haunted by the sound of Kyle's last words. "I'm at the bridge. They're trying to kill me." Weeks turned to months. Flyers faded in the rain. Tips dried up. Friends drifted back into their routines. But the family refused to let go. Every new day without answers deepened the torment. Was he alive somewhere, lost and afraid? Was he gone, his body hidden by the current? The agony lay not just in the not knowing, but in the knowing that the authorities were not truly looking. The cruelest twist came later when his remains were finally discovered, so close to the very place he had named. The family had scoured the river, convinced by his final call to his brother that the water held the answer. And yet, all along, Kyle lay in the shadow of the rail yard, within sight of their search. They had been so close. And yet, without the truth about the 911 call, they had been impossibly far. Looking back, the family sees their efforts not as a failure, but as evidence of love. They searched because they had to, because no one else would. But the bitter truth remains. The official search, the one that should have been mounted with urgency and resources, never happened. There was no coordinated sweep of the area. No floodlights. No helicopters. No grid searches. No crime scene tape. Just a family stumbling through the dark while the authorities stayed silent. It wasn't just that the search had failed. It was that, for Kyle, the search had never truly begun. The first days after Kyle disappeared were filled with a frantic kind of hope. The kind that burns so hot it threatens to consume you. His mother dialed his phone again and again, clinging to the possibility that he would answer, that she'd hear his voice, or even just the sound of him breathing. Each time, silence answered back. The calls went straight to voicemail. The phone, once a lifeline, had gone dark. As the hours stretched into days, the silence grew heavier. The world around the Dunivan family did not stop. Cars still drove past, neighbors still watered their lawns, children still rode their bikes down the street. But inside their home, everything was suspended. Meals sat uneaten, conversations trailed off, and every knock at the door brought a jolt of anticipation followed by crushing disappointment when it was never Kyle. Weeks slipped by. The family plastered missing posters across Kansas City and Olathe. His picture, a young man with kind eyes and a slight, almost shy smile, stared back from gas stations, grocery store boards and telephone poles. At first, people called with tips. Someone thought they had seen him walking near a truck stop. Another was sure they spotted him by the river. Each lead was pursued with urgency. Each ended in heartbreak. Kyle's phone remained missing, a ghostly absence that left investigators with no trail to follow. Without it, no pings, no location history, no crumbs to trace where he might have gone. The lack of digital evidence only deepened the mystery. As summer gave way to fall, the family's energy turned to endurance. His mother replayed every word of their last conversations. The way his voice shook, the desperation in his tone. She asked herself again and again, what exactly had he meant when he said he was being hunted? Were his fears the remnants of his earlier struggles with psychosis? Or was someone truly after him? The what-ifs became unbearable. What if he was alive but trapped somewhere? What if he had been kidnapped and was waiting for rescue? What if he had fallen into the Kansas River, struggling against the current while no one came? Each scenario was worse than the last, and yet she couldn't stop cycling through them, as if imagining every possibility might somehow prepare her for the truth. Police, meanwhile, had gone quiet. Beyond the initial missing persons report, communication dwindled. Months passed without updates. To the family, It felt like Kyle's case had been pushed to the back of a shelf, another file among many gathering dust. They begged for answers but were told again and again that there was nothing new. As the calendar flipped to winter, hope dimmed but never fully died. His mother lit candles for him at church, whispering prayers that her son would walk through the front door. His brother, haunted by their last phone call, returned often to the Kansas River Bridge, staring out across the water, wondering if Kyle had slipped into its depths. He would stand there in the cold, breath rising in clouds, imagining he could still hear Kyle's voice carried on the wind. Seasons shifted again. Spring brought flowers and green grass but no sign of Kyle. Birthdays passed uncelebrated. Holidays came and went with an empty chair at the table. The wait stretched on and on, twisting time into something cruel and endless. It wasn't just the absence of Kyle, it was the absence of answers. The void left behind was filled with dread, speculation, and grief that never had a place to land. Could he still be alive somewhere waiting? Or had something much darker claimed him? The family lived in a limbo of not knowing, each day hoping for news, dreading the call that might finally come. The silence was the worst part. It was late summer when the call finally came. More than a year had passed since Kyle vanished, and the Dunivan family had grown accustomed to the unbearable stillness. But this call shattered it. A Kansas Department of Transportation worker, out on routine maintenance near the river, had stumbled upon something in the brush. Human remains. The site was close, hauntingly close, to where Kyle had last said he was in his 911 call and to where his brother believed he had gone that night. The worker reported finding personal items nearby, clothing, scattered belongings, and fragments that seemed to point to one person, Kyle. When police arrived, they quickly contacted the family. "We're about 90% sure it's him," they said. 90%. Enough to crush hope, but not enough to deliver closure. For Kyle's family, the words landed like a stone in their chest. After more than a year of imagining every possible outcome, this was the one they dreaded most. Yet even as they absorbed the devastating news, they were told they would have to wait. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, forensic labs were overwhelmed. Backlogs stretched for months. DNA confirmation, the only way to make the identification official, would not come quickly. The family was told it could be half a year or more before they had definitive proof. So they entered a new kind of limbo. This one was darker, crueler. They knew in their hearts it was Kyle. The belongings left no doubt. But without that final confirmation, they were left in a purgatory of grief. They could not bury him. They could not mark his grave. They could not even say with absolute certainty that the nightmare had ended. Kyle's mother described it as knowing but not officially knowing. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into the void, and being told you couldn't step forward. Every day the family woke up with the weight of that knowledge pressing down on them. Every night they went to bed haunted by it. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. If Kyle had died near the very place he said he was, why hadn't police searched there more thoroughly? Why had his 911 call been ignored? Why had his family been left to search blindly when the crucial clue had been in the authorities' hands all along? The grim reality settled in. Kyle had been there the entire time. Through all the desperate searches, through the long nights his family spent praying, through the false leads and unanswered questions, his body had been lying near the river, waiting to be found. And when the medical examiner finally reviewed the remains, the news brought no peace. The cause of death was ruled inconclusive. No evidence of foul play. No evidence of suicide. Nothing but questions. The very words Kyle had spoken in his last moments, that people were trying to kill him, were swept aside as though they meant nothing. To his family it felt like a second betrayal. First by the failure to search. Now by the failure to investigate. Kyle was reduced to a statistic, a case without answers, a mystery too inconvenient to unravel. But to those who loved him he was not a statistic. He was a son, a brother, a man whose final cries for help had been ignored. And though the discovery of his remains confirmed what they had feared all along, it did not bring closure. It brought only more anguish, more anger, and the unbearable truth that justice might never come. The wait was over, but the nightmare was not. The day authorities told Kyle's family that remains had been found, life as they knew it fractured. Yet even in that moment of devastating news, there was no finality. Instead, there was a new waiting game, one that would stretch across 8 endless months. The Kansas Department of Transportation workers' discovery had been chilling enough. But when police said, "We're 90% sure it's Kyle," that final 10% became an unbearable cliffhanger. The family had no choice but to wait for DNA confirmation. And waiting in this case meant torture. Every morning, Kyle's mother woke with the same thought: is today the day? Every night, she went to bed with the same answer: silence. There were no calls from the coroner's office. No updates from detectives. No timeline they could cling to. Only an invisible clock ticking away inside their hearts, slowing every beat into something jagged and raw. The COVID-19 pandemic had ground the world to a halt. Laboratories were drowning under backlogs of cases. Families everywhere were waiting for answers about loved ones. But for the Dunivans, the wait carried a special cruelty. They already knew deep down that the remains were Kyle's. His belongings had been found at the scene. His last known location matched the site. His story, though riddled with mystery, pointed squarely to that patch of land near the Kansas River. Still, knowing was not the same as being told. Without the DNA report, there could be no official recognition. No certificate. No burial. No headstone. No closure. The family lived in a limbo so cruel it blurred the lines between grief and madness. Kyle's mother kept his room just as he had left it. The unmade bed. The photographs on the dresser. The books and clothes that seemed to hold his presence like shadows frozen in time. She would sit on the edge of the bed some evenings, running her fingers along the quilt, whispering to him as if he might answer. "I know it's you. I know." Friends tried to comfort her, but even their kindness carried the sting of finality. Some spoke as if Kyle were already gone. Others, tiptoeing around the uncertainty, pretended he might still be alive. Neither approach brought comfort. What she needed was truth. What she received was silence. Her nights were the worst. Sleep became a stranger. She would lie awake, replaying every moment of his life. The boy who scraped his knees riding bikes, the teenager with dreams bigger than his small Kansas town, the young man calling in desperation during his final hours. The replay button in her mind never stopped. She saw him, heard him, lost him over and over again. For his brother, the burden was different but no less heavy. He could not escape the memory of Kyle's last phone call, that fractured voice, trembling with fear, insisting he was near the bridge, insisting someone was after him. The words played like a broken record, and with every repetition came the guilt. Why didn't I get to him in time? Why couldn't I save him? 8 months dragged on. Seasons shifted again. The river froze and thawed. Leaves fell, then bloomed anew. The world moved forward, but the Dunivan family remained trapped in place. Neighbors stopped asking for updates. Friends, though sympathetic, moved on with their own lives. To the family, it felt like the world had forgotten Kyle. But they hadn't. Every day they woke and remembered. Every day they waited. When the phone finally rang, after 8 months of silence, the voice on the other end confirmed what they already knew. DNA results had matched. The remains were officially, conclusively identified as Kyle Dunivan. There were no tears left to cry. Only a hollow ache. The official word was both a relief and a fresh wound. The purgatory of uncertainty was over, but closure still remained out of reach. For now they had a name on a file. What they didn't have was a cause, a reason, or justice. When the medical examiner's final report landed on the Dunivans' kitchen table, the family braced themselves. They had survived the 8-month wait for DNA. Now they hoped for answers, something to stitch together the jagged fragments of Kyle's final hours. Instead, the report offered a single word that shattered them all over again: inconclusive. Kyle's cause of death could not be determined. No evidence of homicide. No evidence of suicide. No signs of foul play officially recognized. Just a body, a void, and questions that grew heavier with every breath. His mother read the report again and again, unable to reconcile it with the reality of her son's final words. Kyle's 911 call had been clear. He said, "They are trying to kill me." He gave a location. He begged for help. Those weren't the words of someone ready to end his own life. They were the words of a man fighting for survival. Yet the medical examiner's language reduced those cries to dust. By ruling his death inconclusive, the system effectively silenced Kyle a second time. For the family, it felt like betrayal layered upon betrayal. First, the authorities had failed to search when Kyle called for help. Then, they withheld the information about his 911 call when he was reported missing. Now, even in death, the system refused to acknowledge his voice. Anger pulsed beneath the grief. His mother asked again and again, how can someone scream for help, name his killers, and end up dead, only for the official record to shrug its shoulders? The lack of answers was worse than cruelty. It was erasure. The inconclusive ruling left the case in limbo. It wasn't closed, but it wasn't active either. Police referred to it as ongoing, but no real investigation was happening. No detectives knocking on doors. No new leads being chased. Just silence again. To Kyle's family, the message was clear. The system didn't want to touch this case. Mentioning his prior psychosis in the missing persons report seemed to have poisoned everything. They believed authorities had decided early on that Kyle wasn't credible. That his words of being hunted were dismissed as delusion rather than desperation. But what if he was telling the truth? That question gnawed at them daily. If someone really had been after Kyle, if he had been lured, tricked, or harmed, then the people responsible were still out there. Free. Untouched. And Kyle's death, stamped with the word inconclusive, gave them the perfect cover. The Dunivans tried to push for more answers. They wrote letters, made phone calls, pleaded for a deeper investigation. Each time the responses were vague, bureaucratic, dismissive. We're still looking into it. We don't have any new information. We'll let you know if something comes up. It was as if Kyle's story had been swallowed whole by the machinery of indifference. At night, his mother dreamed of him. Sometimes she saw him standing on the bridge, waving, calling her name. Other times, he appeared as a boy again, smiling the way he used to, only to vanish before she could hold him. She woke each morning with the ache of someone who had lost her child twice, once to death and again to silence. The inconclusive ruling didn't close the book on Kyle's story. It only deepened the mystery. It left his family stranded between justice and oblivion, clutching at fragments of truth while the world around them demanded they move on. But how do you move on when the system tells you nothing? How do you heal when the last thing your loved one said, the last thing he begged for, is ignored? For Kyle's family, the answer was simple. You don't. You carry the weight. You keep searching. You refuse to let the word inconclusive be the final line in his story. The official report may have ended in a void. But for the people who loved him, Kyle's voice still echoed. And it would not be silenced. The grief of losing a child is a wound no parent should bear, but for Kyle's mother, the pain was compounded by a cruel whisper in her own mind. This might be my fault. She replayed the day she filed the missing persons report in Olathe over and over. In her desperate attempt to give authorities every possible piece of information about her son, she mentioned something that haunted her. The fact that Kyle had once experienced psychosis. Years earlier, under immense stress and poor coping habits, he had spiraled into a brief break with reality. It wasn't permanent. It wasn't who he was. But in that moment, she thought honesty would help investigators understand the bigger picture. Instead, she believes it marked him. From then on, she felt every glance, every dismissive tone, every brush-off carried the same unspoken judgment. Another mentally unstable man. A drug user. A case not worth prioritizing. For Kyle's mother, this realization became unbearable. She blamed herself, as though her words had given police the excuse they needed to sideline her son's disappearance. In her private moments, she cried out to the heavens. If I hadn't said it, would they have taken him seriously? Would he still be alive? The weight of those questions pressed down on her every day. They poisoned her sleep, her meals, her conversations. Family members tried to reassure her. It wasn't your fault. They failed Kyle, not you. But their comfort never reached her heart. In her mind, she carried the guilt like a stone chained around her neck. Even worse was the knowledge that police had failed to connect the dots. When Kyle made that frantic 911 call, giving his exact location, the dispatcher logged it. Yet when she walked into the station the next day, begging them to find her son, no one told her about the call. They had the key to his whereabouts but locked it away. If she had known about it, if she had been told where he was, if she had been able to drive straight there, maybe she could have found him in time. She imagines herself racing down the highway, calling his name, arriving just before it was too late. That fantasy is both a lifeline and a torment. Her burden was not just the loss of her son but the crushing sense that he had been abandoned twice. Once by the people sworn to protect him, and again by a system that hid the truth. She clung to memories of who Kyle really was, not the caricature she believed the authorities painted of him. He was her son, her child with a mischievous smile, her little boy who once dreamed of being an architect. He was not just a case file or a schizophrenic episode. He was human, flawed, and deserving of protection. But she couldn't shake the shame. She found herself apologizing to Kyle in whispered prayers. I'm sorry, son. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't mean to make them doubt you. I only wanted them to help. Every unanswered phone call from investigators, every stalled response, every refusal to release details made the guilt heavier. She began to see the world not as a place of justice, but as a machine designed to ignore the vulnerable. She had done everything she thought she was supposed to do. She reported him missing. She told the truth. And yet, she was left in the same darkness as the day he vanished. The burden grew lonelier with time. Friends and even family members didn't always understand. Some urged her to move on. Others told her that dwelling on guilt wouldn't bring him back. But those words only deepened her isolation. For a mother, moving on wasn't an option. For a mother, guilt wasn't a choice, it was stitched into her very being. Late at night, she scrolled through Kyle's old messages, listening to his voicemails, reading the texts he sent in happier days. His voice, preserved in those small recordings, reminded her of the vibrant man he had been. That memory clashed violently with the way his case was treated. Dismissed, sidelined, ignored. In the quiet hours when the world was asleep, she allowed herself to scream. She screamed at the unfairness, at the authorities, at herself. She screamed at a universe that had stolen her son and replaced him with silence. A mother's burden is not just loss. It is the crushing belief that she should have done more, should have known more, should have somehow rewritten fate. Kyle's mother carried that burden daily, a weight invisible to others but devastatingly real to her. And still, she carried it because she refused to let Kyle's story end in shadows. If the system would not fight for him, then she would. If investigators dismissed him as a case unworthy of answers, she would shout his name louder. That burden, heavy as it was, became her vow. Kyle's story did not end with DNA confirmation, nor with the inconclusive report. Instead, it lingers in a space between fact and mystery, a haunting echo that refuses to fade. Authorities insist his case is ongoing. But that phrase has become a cruel mantra. Ongoing doesn't mean active. Ongoing doesn't mean solved. Ongoing doesn't even mean investigated. It simply means we're not closing it, but we're not telling you anything either. His family lives in this suspended reality, locked out of the answers they deserve. Each time they reach out for information, they are met with the same wall of secrecy. We can't release that, it's part of an ongoing case. We're still looking into it. We'll let you know if anything changes. But nothing changes. The silence is deafening. It leaves room for speculation, for theories, for nightmares. Was Kyle truly experiencing paranoia that night, imagining threats that weren't there? Or were his words literal? Was someone truly trying to kill him? The possibilities torment his family. If he was hallucinating, then why weren't police there sooner to protect him? If he wasn't hallucinating, then why aren't his killers being hunted down? His last words on the 911 tape refused to fade. They tried to kill me. Those words hang in the air like smoke from a fire no one will put out. They are a desperate cry that deserves investigation, not dismissal. And yet, the official record denies them. Kyle's story is more than a single tragedy. It is a mirror reflecting how cries for help can vanish into the void of bureaucracy. It exposes the dangers of bias, the fatal consequences of dismissing someone as unstable. It shows how systems meant to serve and protect can sometimes do the opposite, burying victims in indifference. For his family, the silence is not just about Kyle, it is about justice itself. If Kyle's pleas could be ignored, if his death could be brushed aside with the word inconclusive, then what does that mean for others like him? How many other families are left in the shadows, waiting for answers that will never come? The echoes of his story reverberate not only in Kansas but far beyond. They serve as a warning. When institutions fail to listen, when they dismiss voices crying out for help, the result is not just death, it is erasure. Kyle's family refuses to let that happen. They keep his name alive in conversations, in vigils, in stories like this one. They refuse to let him become another cold case gathering dust in a drawer. His story, they insist, still matters. His voice, though silenced, still speaks. But the truth of what happened to him that June night remains buried with his body, buried under bureaucratic secrecy, buried beneath the biases that colored the investigation. And so his story ends not with resolution but with questions. It ends not with justice but with silence. Kyle's final cry echoes still, "They tried to kill me." And we are left to wonder, was it paranoia, foul play, or the greatest tragedy of all, a system that chose not to listen? For his family, the silence is unbearable. For the rest of us, it is unforgettable.